Let's talk.
John Brown.
The Incidental Feminist, Friend, Foe, or Femme Fatale, The Truth About Thatcher, is a fascinating new book offering a remarkable new view of a remarkable and still underappreciated leader. That's what Simon Jenkins said, the woman behind the politician. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Tina Gaudoin, who is the author of the book itself. Tina, good morning to you.
Good morning from rainy London.
I won't tell you. I won't tell you about the fact that if I stood on my desk, I could see Gibraltar and the shimmering Mediterranean, because I think this would be the shortest interview we'd ever do. Then, wouldn't we? This is one of the things I love about books like this is that we think. You know, if you're a child, if you're born in the 60s, grew up in the 70s, were a student in the 80s, you think I was part of that whole sort of Thatcher was either a sort of a minor, a deity, or she was a demon. It was black and white. It was Marmite. And nobody actually thought about the woman herself, perhaps until that sort of famous photograph of her leaving Downing Street in 1990 with tears in her eyes. What's led you to reappraise and look at the femininity of Margaret Thatcher?
Well, first of all, I think you're right. And I too grew up in the 80s, really, as a sort of child of Thatcher. And I have to say, I didn't vote for her. That's number one. And that's not a defence. That's just kind of where I was at the time, which I think really ties in with what you're talking about. But what I was really struck by was the fact that most of her biographers are men, firstly. Secondly, no one... apart from the moment you're talking about when she left Downing Street, no one has really considered what it's like for her as a woman coming into politics at a time when it was mostly, actually almost exclusively male, almost exclusively upper class. And here's a woman from a lower middle class background who went to grammar school, who made it all the way to the top. And, for us, I think as women, she normalised female power for us. And I just think whether you love her or hate her, as a woman, you can't deny the fact that to some extent we all stand on her shoulders.
Because, she wasn't even supposed to be in the running for the Conservative leadership. It was Keith Joseph, I think, who was going to originally be running against Edward Heath. And he made some very, now it would be totally off the cuff remarks about eugenics. And so she said, I'm going to Edward Heath, I'm going to run against you. And he went, in his normal monotone, you'll lose. Simple as that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Her famous remark was, well, Keith, if you're not going to run, somebody's got to, and it's going to be me, basically, to paraphrase her. And I think almost she took advantage of the situation. A lot of political pundits say that at the time, the Conservative Party was in disarray. There was no one else coming up through the ranks. And I think she just really was determined right from the get-go to be a politician. I'm not sure she thought, in fact, she's on record as saying she didn't think a woman would be PM in her lifetime. But I know very well from everyone I've talked to, she had nerves of steel, and she decided at that moment, I think, to really go for it. Because... I'm not going to drop the W word on you. To say, well, everybody's got a backstory. They're doing a thing because it's diverse and the whole situation. But back in the 70s and 80s, she wasn't saying that she was doing this because she was a woman, and she wasn't making a point of being a trailblazer to be the first female prime minister in the UK. She was just doing it because she still thought she was going to be damn good for the job. But that's quite right. And she famously said to Terry Wogan when he said to her, I notice men don't make exceptions for you because you're a woman. She said, no, and why should they? I don't make exceptions for them because they're men. And I think that really sums up her perspective. And I also think with feminism, I think she really thought, look, I've achieved, and it would be a disservice to women to give them a leg up. They can achieve in the same way that I can. I don't entirely agree with that at all. But nonetheless, that was her perspective. She always said, I want the best person for the job.
And also, she's driven, and rightly or wrongly, whatever your politics would be, with a vision that she had for the country. You're coming out of UK, and people going about broken Britain now, but if you look at the winter of discontent, and the famous the campaigns that said, Labour isn't working and bodies piling in the streets and dustman strikes. That is a broken Britain. And she has a vision of how she wants the country to be, and she runs with it, doesn't she?
She certainly does run with it, and I think on that note, I think it'd be really interesting to poll people in Britain now and abroad to see whether they would accept her now as a PM. I'm pretty sure that we'd be surprised by the result, because she started off knowing exactly what she wanted for Britain, and arguably she put Britain back on the map when it was completely broken.
Yeah. Interesting as well that you say that, because the thing is, there is a it's been a while now since she was in power, to put it mildly, and they would go, oh, she don't have anything to do with these small boats, etc. But if you look at Thatcher's policies, she's a child of the Second World War as well. She knows how important Europe is to, and NATO especially is. And this is talking on the day that obviously there are drones being going over into Poland, and she also recognises that the value of transatlantic politics, perhaps more than, an awful lot is made about the special relationship between herself and Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, an awful lot is made of it, but I think it's completely right. And Charles Pole, who was her foreign secretary, her foreign advisor for a very long time, said to me that you can't underestimate the fact that in all of the international conferences, because of the way the placement went and the alphabetical order went, Reagan and Thatcher were always sat next to each other. So aside from the fact that they had a very good personal and political relationship, they were uniquely seated together and they communicated together all the time, and they were photographed together all the time. So they visualized a united front, if you like, as well as presenting one.
The book's called, Friend Foe, which obviously, if the Iron Lady, this lawyer is not for turning, all that. So that's Friend and Foe. You can go and get that. And Femme Fatale. And I was looking at a few bits and pieces, and she once voted the fourth most erotic woman in the world by there used to be a thing called, was it the Erotic Review by Roland, which is Roland Penning's.
Roland Pelling.
Yeah, exactly.
No, completely. I think what's really interesting about her is, during the 80s, I very clearly remember my parents go, my father was an immigrant and actually did really well. And kind of, he was exactly the sort of person she liked, because she appreciated, I think, people who did well, who came from anywhere. And I remember my parents going to Number 10 and me thinking, what is all the fuss about? And my mother coming back and saying, she's really very attractive, and particularly to men. And I couldn't believe that. But the more and more I've talked to people, the more I hear that it wasn't just power. It was something that she had. She flattered and kind of semi-seduced men. And actually, frankly, this came in very helpful with men in politics.
Which is really interesting, because if you look at if you look at women in politics, or women, strong women throughout history, they have been demonized, and they are either, over-sexualized or asexual. And they normally get a really, really bad press and a bad write-up. So, and we don't, I suppose an awful lot of she was seen as a modern Boudica, as a modern Britannia, or at least a late 20th century Boudica.
Yeah, but I think I argue in my book that that's far too binary for her. She was multifaceted, and to think that she didn't have the ability to charm, let's say, Giscard d'Estaing, or, the more difficult leaders, the more difficult politicians inside and outside her cabinet. She had that old-fashioned ability. First of all, she was really well turned out. People have mentioned this to me a lot recently. She would not dream of appearing in Parliament in the things that we see people in today. She thought it was disrespectful to the voters to appear anything other than what my mother would have called really well turned out.
Right.
And I think that whole persona brought with it, and the persona of power as well, brought with it a sort of sexual frisson, if you like. And actually, up close, people said she was quite beautiful skin, lovely eyes, and frankly, let's face it, a lot of upper middle class men kind of related to her in a way that she was either a sort of nanny or a dominatrix. both of which, I mean, obviously I'm not really sort of going on record as saying that, but obviously there are a lot of men who like that, know, and let's not pretend they don't, especially during the sort of heated debates in Parliament.
Because again, she's the consummate politician, and she will use all of the weapons in her armoury to get what she wants, even if it includes, the subtly raised eyebrow or whatever else.
Yeah, and there's a very famous piece by Vanity Fair by a writer called Gail Sheehy, who actually counted, she used to rock back and forwards at the dispatch box and actually counted how many times she sort of leant forward and back in a slightly seductive way, tapping her heels. And, you couldn't say that was overtly sexual, but you could say it had some sort of attractiveness about it that you wouldn't obviously see from a man. P.S. She did get judged a lot more harshly than men in Parliament, who could turn up in a tatty old suit. She would never have done that, because she would have known full well that she would have suffered criticism for it, as women do today.
Exactly. That is the double standards in which the media look at the way that a woman the woman presents herself in all aspects. And I suppose it all goes back to the she is in politics not because she wants to then go off and have a very rich life, sort of signing up business contacts from her time, her 4 brief years or whatever, or 2 brief years, or go on the speaking circuit. She's in the business of politics because she wants to, again, as we said before at the beginning, she wants to be the change. She has a vision, and she's going to drag 70s Britain into sort of 80s Britain and all that entails.
Yeah, and she was absolutely passionate. Her number one passion, aside from Dennis, obviously, was Britain. She was 100% behind Britain. She really wasn't interested in speaking tours or doing deals or anything else. She was passionately interested in the future of the British people. And she also had that ethos of public service, I think, which we don't actually see so much today.
And there's a gentle side to her. I mean, because there's the famous picture of her on the tank in West Germany at the time, and it goes, but that one flashed around the world. People go, oh, there you go, it's Thatcher the warmonger. But actually, her relationship with and people talk about the covenant that we have with the armed forces, but she would get. The military was important to her. Those who made the ultimate sacrifice, their families, their dependents, were important to her as well. It wasn't just especially with the Falklands, she felt a deep bond with that military, and it wasn't for media sort of sympathy or anything like that. She felt that.
No, and she was absolutely passionate about servicemen. And actually in my book, I talk about the fact that the times she really did cry and the times that other people saw her crying were particularly during the Falklands, when we lost what she would call our boys. Mm. And she was absolutely dedicated to the armed forces and the armed services. She had a great belief in them and the need for them to represent how powerful Britain was on a world stage.
You mentioned Dennis there. I mean, he was at the time, and I remember, anyone for Dennis. He was almost a figure of fun, but he was the rock, wasn't he? He was the anchor, and he stayed in the back. He stayed pretty much in the background. And when he passed, it was a devastating blow to her.
It was a devastating blow, and she acknowledged many times that without Dennis's stability, support, and frankly, money, she would never have been able to do what she did. When she came into politics, it was at a time when people weren't even being paid properly for MP salaries were negligible. So without Dennis, she freely admitted she would have gotten nowhere. And actually, when he died, she said, the thing about Dennis was, without him, I never felt alone. And I think, she had a job wherein she potentially could have felt alone an awful lot of the time, but she always had him in the background to support her.
When you spoke to, how willing are people to actually, her contemporaries, I mean, those who are still around, obviously, you speak to them about this. I mean, how willing are they to sort of be truthful about it? Because obviously this is now 25, 35 years after the event. Is it, because people, if you don't have the primary sources sort of hot off the press, as it were, they tend to sort of put the rose tinted spectacles on. I mean, how brutally honest were they about Lady Thatcher, about Margaret?
I think that's a good question. And actually, I did speak to most of the remaining members of her cabinet at the time. including Norman Tebbit, who passed away recently, who was absolutely charming and very forthcoming, Michael Heseltine equally, all sorts of people who I talked to, and they were quite brutally honest, actually, Jonathan Aitken. It was a sort of quite revealing time. But what I would also say, just a note, is that the two people who I think she directly owed their careers to her, John Major and Theresa May, were the two people who very firmly immediately declined. And I say in my book, I found that extremely surprising because were the boot to be on the other foot, I'm absolutely sure she would not have done the same.
Why? I mean, that's an interesting, especially for Theresa May, because, without Thatcher, there is no Theresa May. And Major, of course, again, he becomes British Prime Minister, and he wouldn't have got his in without Thatcher. But especially May, because by that point, we're now on our fourth female Conservative leader.
Yeah. I mean, she was a direct beneficiary of Margaret Thatcher, as was John Major. You made that point. But I was especially surprised by Theresa May because I think if anyone owes her a great debt, and I said before, as women, I believe we all do to some extent, but Theresa May absolutely 100% owes her that debt.
Perhaps it's the shadow that she can't, the shadow is so large that you can't be another Thatcher because you will be compared to Thatcher, and therefore you have to bring the same values as Thatcher but put your own spin on it, and perhaps May failed in that respect?
Possibly, but I feel. I mean, I'm guessing now. I'm stabbing in the dark, really, but I would say that Margaret Thatcher would have found that an entirely graceless perspective. She would have thought one must be bigger than that, and one must speak of people who have achieved in a positive way.
But you might say that in an age of identity politics now, that the policy of the tweet or the social media, perhaps there isn't that largesse. Perhaps there isn't the grown up politics of which Thatcher and that whole generation. I mean, for Heseltine to speak of Thatcher and be honest about it, because he perhaps lost out the most because he was the bright young thing.
He did, and let me tell you, he's still quite a bright young thing when you speak to him. He's frighteningly intelligent and completely on the ball. And there is a speculation, I mentioned this in my book, that in fact, whilst they overtly hated each other, they kind of secretly were attracted to each other because they were, in fact, quite similar. So they had this frisson, if you like, which manifested in arguments, really. She was actually a bit scared of him, and equally he was a bit scared of her, I think. And he said to me, look, I didn't like her, but you don't have to like someone to be in politics with them. And I think that's completely right. And he was very gracious about her.
Yes, indeed. Tarzan and the Iron Lady. And then, of course, you've got Cecil Parkinson in the background, just sort of... Yes. Was it a fun book? Did this book take you in a direction you weren't quite sure it was going to go to when you started it, Tina?
Yeah. No, it totally did. And much has been made recently of the fact that I speculated that she was autistic. And I didn't, that came out of the blue. It was because I had access to the letters between her and her sister Muriel, which only Charles Moore, her authorised biographer, had before. And when I was reading through these letters, the letters are a lot of lists about clothing. She was fascinated and passionate about clothing. And it struck me that these lists were lists I'd sort of seen before from children who were neurodiverse and listed things like trains and planes and things like that. So I started to investigate that. And the more I investigated it, her famous lack of sense of humour, her inability to sleep, her notorious rudeness, her inability to get jokes, her lack of empathy, all of that. It's impossible to retrospectively diagnose someone, but all of that did add up to me thinking, this is very interesting. And I do write a chapter in the book about that.
That's really interesting, because I was having a conversation of lunch yesterday with a very old friend of mine who's in his late 80s. And he was saying, he was hardworking, he was centered, he was this, he made lists. And he said, he might be, he said, I might be, if I was to come back and be, I'd probably be diagnosed autistic because I have these, I have a a goal, I go for it with grim determination, and I got all these various bits and pieces. And it's, getting up at whatever time in the morning. And he said, perhaps I am a little bit on the spectrum, of course, and that sets a lot of alarms bells ring with people, doesn't it? As you discovered, Tina.
Yeah, but I did discover that. But let me also say that I regard it, and I talk about this, as a superpower, not as a detrimental aspect, because really without that focus, that intellectual ability, that drive, which a lot of neurodiverse people I know have, you wouldn't succeed in the way you do. So I think it's an absolute positive, not a negative.
What are you hoping that people learn? And also, how did this book change your relationship with Margaret Thatcher in the way you do?
I have a lot more empathy for her than I did. I feel a lot more sympathy. I absolutely admire her 100% for what she did and what she achieved. And before I wrote it, I really didn't understand what politics was like in the 50s, 60s and 70s, honestly, because in the 70s I was at school, I didn't have a clue. So, and I did quite a lot of history, but I really, she's not taught in schools at all. But a lot of sort of 20-somethings know absolutely nothing about her. So one of the things I'm hoping for is that more people get to understand her a bit better. And another thing I'm hoping for is that people think about her and other politicians, particularly women, as multidimensional characters, not as binary characters.
The book is called The Incidental Feminist. If people want to, and you can, by the way, listeners, you can go onto our own virtual bookstore. You'll see this lovely portrait of Lady Thatcher. Click on that and the book will be winging its way to you. If people want to find you online, where's the best place to find you to say nice things?
Probably on Instagram. I post on Instagram a lot at the moment. It's at Tina Gaudoin. I have a website as well, which is Tina Gaudoin. But I'm posting a lot, and I'm posting a lot of the stuff that I found from the archives and stuff like that at the moment. So if people are interested, that's probably the best place to go.
The book is called The Incidental Feminist. It's by Tina Gaudoin, who's speaking today. Tina, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.